Do you ever feel confused by the teachings within Mahayana Buddhism? Or have you struggled to understand some abstract phrases such as all phenomena are empty, all dharmas are just consciousness, reality is just mind? What do these teachings really mean, and how can they help us resolve our suffering and deal with the problems and challenges in our lives? If you'd like to understand better how the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism are not contradictory, but actually complementary, and if you'd like to learn how to apply these theories in your actual day to day life, then keep watching. Hi everyone, my name is David Lisson, and I'm a teacher within the Dharma Drum lineage of Chan Buddhism. Today I'd like to dive deep into the topic of Mahayana Buddhism and its three systems of thought. So it's my purpose in making this video to address the questions and doubts that people have about Mahayana Buddhism. I hope to clarify the theoretical standpoint of these three systems of thought within the Mahayana, and I hope to talk about how to apply these systems of thought to practice in daily life. And this refers to the practice of developing wisdom, which is the insight that resolves our suffering. I also hope to inspire your further study and introspection, because honestly, I can't do this topic justice with just one video or even three brief videos. So I hope that you continue to study and introspect on your own. Dependent origination is the foundation of all Buddhist teachings. It describes the arising of suffering as well as the ceasing of suffering. What are the conditions that bring our psychological distress about? And what are the conditions that can resolve this distress? And in Mahayana Buddhism, dependent origination not only refers to the conditioned nature of suffering, but that all phenomena are conditioned, and that the very nature of everything in the world, everything in the universe, is that of arising in dependence on other things. Dependent origination, or the Chinese is 缘起, is the most common foundation teaching of all traditions of Buddhism. Sometimes it's translated as dependent origination. Today I'll be using the term conditioned arising. The Buddha, in different discourses, uses different ways to describe this process of the conditioned nature of our human experience, as well as the conditioned nature of all phenomena. Now, why are there three different ways to explain one principle? I think it's important to know that the Buddha was a very skilled teacher, and he spoke to many different people of many different backgrounds. So in ancient India, about 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was sharing his insight with everyone without discrimination. So he'd share with the most wealthy or the most elite class or caste in society. And the Buddha also shared with the lowest class or the lowest caste. These groups of people were shunned by most of society. And the Buddha even invited these outcasts of society to join his group of practitioners, monks and nuns who devoted their life to this way of insight, this way of going beyond suffering. So the Buddha was a very skilled teacher, and he adapted to his audience. He knew that everyone had a different way of learning and a different capacity. So very well-educated people, well-versed in spiritual teachings, he gave certain explanation to them, whereas other people who may not have been so well-educated, not so well-versed in different philosophy, he gave teachings in a way to suit them. What's wonderful about the variety of teachings, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, is that it allows people of these different capacities, different perspectives, to understand the principle of the Buddha's teachings and grasp it in their own way. But the problem of having so much variety of theory is that it can also create misunderstanding and conflict because people attach to theories, or we attach to our own ways of thinking. And of course, we want our way to be the best way. So it's known that within Buddhism, scholars or adherents of certain schools of thought within Buddhism, they would argue with each other. And although dependent origination is the foundation of the Buddhist teaching, there were these still arguments that developed as to which way is the most ultimate expression of reality. What is the best teaching or the highest teaching? And Master Yin Shun Dao Shi, who was a late modern scholar of Chinese Buddhism as well as Indian Buddhism, he said, as to which teaching is the ultimate one, wise people should reflect carefully. In my perspective, what teaching is the best teaching? Well, it's the teaching that you can understand the easiest. The teaching that we can understand in a way that allows us to apply it and actually gain benefit from it. It's not that we're here to just believe in some kind of doctrine and adhere to some kind of belief system, but rather the theory of Buddhism is just like an instruction manual, so that we use this manual to guide our practice so that we can experience the insight of the Buddha. So there are three systems of thought, or three perspectives within the Mahayana. And the late Master Yin Shun has categorized these three systems as follows. The first is called the empty nature mere name system, or 性空唯名系, which focuses on the teachings of emptiness. Second is what he calls the false imagination mere consciousness system, or the 虚妄唯识系, which is referring to the teachings about consciousness, or what's referred to as consciousness only, which describes the many functions of our mind and how it either creates or resolves suffering. The third system is called the truly eternal mere mind system, or the 真常唯心系, which refers to teachings that emphasize Buddha nature, or this inherent capacity for enlightenment that all of us have. So today I'll focus on the first system of thought, which refers to the teachings on emptiness, or Kong. So the teachings on emptiness within Mahayana Buddhism are most best expressed by the discourses of the Buddha, such as the Prajna Paramita Sutras, of which the most well-known teachings come from the Diamond Sutra, Jinggang Jing, or the Heart Sutra, Xin Jing. These are very popular texts within Chan and Zen Buddhism. Also, the teachings on emptiness were further articulated and explained by a great teacher named Nagarjuna, or Long Shu Pusa. A couple of the most well-known treatises or commentaries by Nagarjuna are the treatise on the Paramita of Great Wisdom, or Dazhidu Lun, as well as the treatise on the Middle Way, or Zhongguan Lun. Emptiness simply refers to the fact that everything arises because of conditions, and it has no self-nature. And there's a phrase to capture that, which says, 缘起性空, conditionally arising, lacking self-nature. So it's important to understand that this word emptiness, which is maybe not the best translation in English, but it's become the most popular, the Sanskrit word shunyata. The Chinese translation kong can be translated as being empty or spacious, but a better English translation of shunyata is more like insubstantial, meaning that something is there, but it's not solid, it's not unchanging. So everything exists, it has a substance to it, but it's constantly changing, and it's changing based on conditions. It arises because of certain conditions, and it also ceases because of conditions. Any one thing exists because of innumerable number of cooperating causes or elements. So let's use a tree, for example. A tree, we can say, because it arises due to many different conditions, there's actually no tree nature. There's no permanent or separate thing there that exists because of itself or by itself that we can just call tree. So, what does that mean? In terms of time, how does a tree come about? So, for example, a redwood tree, a 250-foot tall, enormous tree that's been around for 1,000 years or more. How does that tree come to be? Well, at one point in time, the tree is just a seed, right? And it could be a tiny seed. That seed, eventually, due to certain conditions, grows. And over time, that seed becomes a sprout, becomes a sapling, and over the years grows into this enormous being. So we could see that what we call a tree actually started as a seed. So is it a tree, or isn't it also a seed? Or isn't it also a sprout or a sapling? We have all these different names, but it's actually what has arisen from this seed, this initial cause. And over time, it changes, it grows, it develops. Is it a seed, or is it a tree? The teachings of emptiness say that, well, it's neither the same thing, but it's also not two different things, right? We can't say that a tree, this enormous 250-foot tall object, is the same thing as a seed, but we also can't say it's different because it arose from the seed. So it's neither the same nor different. So that's understandable, right? In terms of time, a tree is empty of tree nature because at one point in time, it was a seed. And if the tree did have a permanent self, if there was such thing as tree, then wouldn't it always exist as a tree? Why would it need to be a seed if it was always a tree? If it actually had this permanent tree nature, then it would never be a seed. And if it was truly a permanent thing, it had a permanent self nature, then the tree would never die. And it's obvious from our observation that that's not the case. There's nothing permanent there about the tree called tree. There's no tree nature. And if we also look to before the time the seed existed, before the seed that became this giant tree was in the ground, where was it? Did it just not exist at all? Before the seed was on the ground, it was part of another tree. And before it even emerged as a seed on the other tree, did it exist, or was there nothing? It wasn't that nothing existed. It was just that before the seed came to be, the conditions were there in the other parts of the tree. So in this way, we can't even find the ultimate beginning of the tree that we're looking at right now. The beginning is not just when it was a seed. Even before that, there was beginningless causes and conditions that were ripening in order to bring about the eventual seed, what we sometimes perceive as the beginning. And when the tree that we're looking at right now falls over and dies, is that the end of the tree? Is that the end of its life? For those of you who spend time in the forest, you may know that when a tree falls over and is now part of the forest floor, it may seem that it's dead, that its life is over. But we know that that tree decomposes and becomes part of the soil and becomes nutrients for other trees. The fallen tree could also be a home for animals, for small insects. And the fallen tree could also be nutrients for another tree. And you may often see that the very same tree that has fallen over and has appeared to die, there's another sprout of the same tree coming from its roots or coming from the body of the decaying tree. So, in this way, even the beginning or the end of the tree cannot be found. So, the birth or the death of the tree, these words, birth and death, beginning and end, can't really accurately express reality because there's no finite beginning or ultimate end of something. And in terms of space, a tree also depends on many other elements and many other conditions that are not tree. So if we look at when it was a seed, how did that seed grow to become a tree? Did the seed just grow by itself, all by itself without needing anything else? You just throw the seed on the ground? Of course, we know that's not the case. The seed requires all kinds of conditions: the right soil, the right depth in the soil, the right nutrients and microorganisms within the soil. Certain seeds also require a certain temperature, a certain amount of heat or cold in order for them to then sprout. And of course, we know that seeds need water, need moisture. Some trees need more moisture than others. Some trees or plants need very little moisture in order to thrive and in order to grow. And of course, sunlight. And some seeds actually need a certain degree of disturbance, which is usually caused by other animals or tiny bacteria, in order for that seed to begin the growth process. So we can see that the seed itself, the initial cause of the tree becoming a tree, needed so many different conditions in order to be, in order to exist and thrive. And once the tree is fully grown, can it now exist by itself without anything else? Of course, we know that's also not true. It still needs water. It still needs light. It still needs certain temperature. And we've even found that certain trees even need fire for them to then open up their seed pods and release their own seeds to continue the trees of the next generation. So when we look and we see this giant tree at this very moment, we can still say there's no tree there. Because what part of it is the actual tree? Apart from its own separate parts. We have leaves, we have branches, we have the trunk, we have roots, right? These are different parts of the tree. Well, which part is the tree itself? Aren't these different parts with different functions? The leaves receiving light, the roots absorbing moisture from the ground, and then we have the bark of the tree, which is the outer skin that protects it. And then we have the inner parts of the tree, such as the wood, which is dry, parts of the wood which is very moist, and there's fluids and nutrients flowing through them, kind of like the way blood flows through our veins. The closer we look at a tree, we see many more parts. We see countless parts, and even tiny, tiny cells, which appear to be individual parts and pieces. So they seem to be different than just the tree itself, but actually each one of these cells, each one of these parts of the tree cannot be totally separated. So they're not totally separate, they're not different things, but they're also not just one thing. So we could see that the word tree is less and less accurate, because a tree is not just one thing, it's a combination or a collection of many things. But we can also say that it's neither one nor many. And then if we look outside the tree to all the conditions we just mentioned, like heat, moisture, light, all those conditions seem to be outside of the tree. But how could they be really outside the tree if they're nourishing the tree and actually become part of what's inside the tree? What's outside eventually becomes what's inside. All the nutrients from the soil are absorbed into the tree and become part of the tree. And then the tree is also releasing nutrients or releasing waste. You could say the tree releases oxygen as part of its process of living and thriving. And the tree also, we can see the leaves falling off the tree. And whatever falls off the tree becomes what's then outside of the tree. So it's interesting how even inside and outside, it's not an accurate way of representing reality, because what's outside becomes what's inside, and vice versa. So after all this explanation, after all this investigation of our perception of a tree, we can see that this word tree is less and less accurate. A tree is just a name, what's called a false name, or 假名. It's a name which is useful because it helps us to communicate with each other, helps us to function in day-to-day life. We can say, oh, look at that tree. Let's admire it together. Or, oh, let's go climb that tree. Or, let's go use that tree. Let's cut it down and make it into firewood. Or maybe we say, let's plant a tree so that we have more shade, so that it's cooler, so that the air is fresher. Our language, our names of things is useful, but they're actually just ideas, and they can't capture the reality of things. So what does this have to do with us? Well, our human life is also just like this. Our human life, our body, our mind, is also empty of self. Although we each have our own name, my name is David. What is a David? It's a name. And actually, I had a different name at a different point in my life. When I was a monk, my name was Changwen. So am I Changwen or am I David? Although there's a name, what part of me is permanent? What part of me is a separate self? If we look closely, not only logically, but if we observe closely our body, our mind, we can see that it's just a constant change of conditions. In time, the conditions change from moment to moment, and in terms of space, our body, our mind, is also dependent on countless conditions in order to exist. We know that our body needs constant nutrition from the environment in terms of food and air. Our mind needs constant information in order for us to learn and grow and function. So psychologically, we're constantly receiving more information, which then becomes the content of our minds. And we can experience that. Our feelings, our experience of the world and how it feels, pleasant or unpleasant, our perceptions of the world, whether what we see is beautiful, that we like it, or whether the things that we encounter are not beautiful. We perceive them as terrible, which causes us painful emotions. We can observe that over time, these feelings and perceptions are always changing. So amidst this constantly changing body and mind, constantly integrated and interacting with the environment, where is the self that we every day refer to? Where is this I that we're always talking about? Where is this I that we're constantly obsessed with? Even though we can't even logically prove the existence of a self, we somehow feel that there is a self. We somehow feel that something is permanent and separate within us. So we have a deep belief in this I, a deep belief in this self. And this deep sense of self is reinforced with our language, using the word I, constantly referring to our name. Because of this belief, perception of self, we perceive the world as being a collection of selves. The world is just a bunch of individual selves opposite to ourselves. And for the selves or for the things that we like, for the things that we are attracted to, we try to obtain them. For the things that we're not attracted to, that we want to get away from, we try to avoid them. Seeing the world as being a collection of selves, separate, independent, fixed selves and things, this is what Buddhism refers to as ignorance, or 愚痴. This basic ignorance, or perceiving things through name and through concepts, leads us to craving. It leads us to crave the things that we perceive that are attractive or beneficial to us. We crave them and we seek after them. And for the things that seem unattractive or not beneficial to us, we try to avoid them. This craving, aversion, as well as the countless views and opinions that are based on our perception of self and things, leads to constant thinking, obsessive thinking, and it leads to all kinds of troublesome behavior. So this is the dependent origination of suffering. Our suffering is dependent on ignorance. It's dependent on the perception of a self and a world made up of things. And this constant conflict of seeking what we like and avoiding what we don't like. And this is basic Buddhism. This is dependent origination of fundamental Buddhism, which is expressed clearly in the teaching of the 12 links of conditioned arising, or the 12 因缘. In terms of the Mahayana view of emptiness, emptiness points out that every aspect of these 12 links of conditioned arising is empty. The first and most important link being ignorance. Emptiness points out that ignorance is also empty of being a thing in itself. Ignorance is not some thing that is planted inside of us, some kind of original sin where we're doomed forever, or ignorance is not some insurmountable obstacle within us that we need to try to get rid of. Because if we see ignorance as some kind of thing and we think to ourselves, I have to get rid of this ignorance. I'm so ignorant. I have to somehow get rid of this self. That itself is conflict. That kind of view of myself versus ignorance, or even myself versus myself, emptiness points out that ignorance itself is not a thing. Ignorance is just a moment-to-moment lack of awareness and attachment to names, attachment to ideas. If ignorance is just a moment-to-moment attachment to our ideas and concepts, then it's not actually a thing, it's just a process. Ignorance itself is conditioned and arises just due to a lack of awareness, and arises due to an attachment to our perceptions, attachment to names, concepts. When those conditions cease, ignorance ceases. The moment that we're aware of attaching to false names or 假名, then in that very moment, we can let them go. And our mind is free from ignorance. and we're free from our obsessive, self-centered thinking and motivation. And with that freedom of mind, with that clarity of mind, we see everything as empty. Not everything as meaningless, but we see everything as empty of a fixed and permanent self. So we no longer cling to things. We no longer invest so much emotion in trying to acquire or trying to avoid things. Because things very naturally, due to their empty nature, change based on conditions. So we could say this kind of freedom and clarity of mind is wisdom. However, emptiness also reminds us that wisdom is not a thing. In the Heart Sutra, it says that not only ignorance is not a thing, but wisdom is not a thing. It says there is no wisdom or any attainment. 无智亦无得. Wisdom is just a name to describe this experience of the absence of ignorance. Ignorance is not a thing. Wisdom is also not a thing. But we still use names to talk about this process, to talk about this experience or this way of being. But emptiness reminds us to be careful not to set up wisdom as some target so that we're always thinking, oh, I just have to realize wisdom. When am I going to be wise? When am I going to get rid of this ignorance and realize wisdom and be a wise person? And some people who practice Buddhism after a number of years, they may think, I've been practicing for 30 years and I'm already a wise person compared to all these other people who are, they're just starting on the path. I'm the one with wisdom. This kind of attitude where we take wisdom to be our attainment actually makes wisdom now into our suffering. Our arrogance becomes our obstruction. Arrogance becomes a condition for suffering. So with this experience of wisdom, this experience of the wisdom of non-attainment, we also realize that the thing that we fear the most, which is loss, the loss of the things that we love, even the loss of our own life. With wisdom, with insight, we realize that birth and death are also empty. Birth and death are also just false names that cannot capture reality. The treatise on the Middle Way by Nagarjuna, which I mentioned earlier, has one very famous line which goes like this. It says that all things are not born, not dying, not permanent, not annihilated, not the same or different, not coming or going. And by explaining causes and conditions, we satisfactorily cease all useless speculation. Does that verse remind you of anything we just talked about? In using the example of the tree, we can see that reality just cannot be captured in names, in concepts like birth and death, beginning, end, the same, different, inside, outside. So emptiness reminds us that reality is beyond these concepts. Just like the beginning of a tree does not just start with the seed. That's not really the birth of the tree, or the conditions that brought about the tree can be traced back even before the seed, and even before that, and endlessly if we go back in time. The future of the tree, even after it falls and collapses to the ground and appears to be lifeless, we can see that it's nutrition and it's a source of life for other beings. And we can see that our own life is the same. With what we call death, it's not the end. Although our body is not functioning and is now decomposing, our body actually becomes nutrition for future life, right? And all of our behavior and the effects of all the actions that we engaged in when we were alive still continues to have influence on future generations. We're not really dead or nothing. Everything we ever did, everything we ever were, continues to be nutrition, continues to be an influence for future life, for future living beings. And I'm sure you know that great people throughout history have made an enormous impact and influence on future generations. The very teachings that we are discussing today, they exist today because of the influence of not only the Buddha, but the generations of teachers and practitioners after him. And for every ordinary person who may not seem to be noticed, for every one of us who may not seem to be famous or influential, each one of us has influence on society. We influence the people around us, and we even influence the people that we don't even know in ways which we may not even notice by just being careful and considerate, holding a door for someone, allowing someone to go first when you're driving, allowing someone to get into the lane in front of you. The effects of these actions influence and spread throughout society. Emptiness reminds us that birth and death are just ideas and cannot capture reality. So the teachings on emptiness point out that the idea of nirvana, the idea of this experience or way of being without suffering, is not some kind of state or not some kind of place that we should aim to go to. We're not aiming to get into nirvana and escape the world. This dualistic understanding of nirvana being separate from samsara, or the world of suffering, this dualistic view is actually a barrier, because we can crave for nirvana or seek to get to nirvana and have an aversion to the world. That's a kind of suffering. Emptiness reminds us that nirvana and samsara, they're not separate. They're not two different things. Rather, nirvana is just an experience of being, a way of being without ignorance, without suffering. So in the world, we can experience the wisdom of the Buddha, the wisdom of no attainment, which is simply a mind that's freed from any obstruction, even the obstructions of attaching to Buddhist ideas and ideals. Even the most lofty teachings of Buddhism need to be let go of. So just to put this all in context, the teachings of emptiness evolved based on the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. The Buddha and Nagarjuna and many wise teachers in between that time saw that people were easily attached to theories, to ideas. For the philosophers and the scholars, they were attached to their philosophy. For religious clerics, they were attached to their religious beliefs. For example, some people believed that fire was the ultimate element which ruled the universe. Everything came from fire, or everything came from light. Other philosophies emphasized the soul, that there was some kind of permanent being within the body or even outside the body, and that this soul was something that you could find or you could realize through meditative practice. So people were attached to their views, and they were also attached to the states of mind that they experience in meditation. And in some deep forms of concentration, it may seem like there's something permanent that's always there, like a soul or a self inside of us. And that kind of experience of just unity and purity of mind, it feels liberating. But the problem is, when a person comes out of that state, where is their soul then? Where is their self then? They may find there's a conflict because they can't find that self anymore. They can't find or unite with that soul in a condition of daily life. Emptiness points out that the soul or the self, even the spiritually exalted self, is empty. There's nothing substantial about it. What a person may experience as a soul or a self is just a process of mental activity. It's a process of a calmed state of mental activity. If we cling to this spiritually exalted, unified self, that's still a problem. And it can still lead to all kinds of conflict and suffering in our lives. So emptiness is a tool to point out the insubstantial nature of all of our concepts and all of our experiences. Over the generations, especially during the time of Nagarjuna, it was a tool for debate. And people used this approach of emptiness to debate all kinds of theories and to cut all of these theories down, even to cut down the theory of emptiness itself, in saying that emptiness is also not a thing. So the tool of emptiness can cut through attachment to concepts. The tool of emptiness can help cut through our attachment to experiences. And it's a tool to even cut through our attachment to the ideals of Buddhism. In conclusion, the teachings on emptiness in Mahayana Buddhism are very simple and direct. Every single phenomenon is a result of causes and conditions. And because of that, nothing has its own self-nature. Nothing anywhere has a permanent or independent quality about it. So because of that, our words and our language, words which seem to define a self, names which seem to point out the existence of a self, are actually false. So there's a saying that when the path of words and language is severed, and when the place of mental activity ceases, that is insight. When we let go of all ideas and just purely experience life, that's the wisdom of non-attainment. When we let go of the most subtle idea of ourself, we are free. Free to experience life in a liberated and lively way. In the Chan tradition, we probably wouldn't spend nearly as much time to explain emptiness, but rather tell someone to go have some tea. Chan Master Zhao Zhou was known for responding to questions about Buddhism, questions about emptiness and the nature of reality with a very simple response: to go have some tea. 吃茶去. Just go drink tea with all of your attention, with all of your being, without any concept of who's drinking, what is being drunk, or the drinking itself. Just have some tea. But even within the Chan tradition, we still study these ideas of Mahayana Buddhism, these systems of thought. We still use the instructions of emptiness to help guide our direction in practice. Now, when some people hear of the teachings of emptiness, they may feel confused. They may not have such a strong logic or ability to reason and reason through that all things are empty. And some people may think that emptiness just means nothingness. It's hard for them to get past that misunderstanding. Some people misunderstand that the practice of meditation is to get into some kind of state where there's nothing, an experience of blankness or the absence of anything, the absence of feeling or thought. And it's for these people who need a different way of learning that the teachings of consciousness only are presented in the Mahayana. And for that deeper explanation on consciousness, I'll see you in the next video.